Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Nadia Akvisan. I'm the Executive Director of the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination. And we're partnering this evening with Princeton Law, P-Law, or LAPA 2.0, as they used to be called by some of the folks who have been here longer. Thank you, as I said, for joining us. This is an important conversation that we decided to have on a topic as we're approaching the 2-year mark of the brutal invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And personally, I witnessed the Balkan Wars and the Balkan tribunals, and obviously this is a topic very close to my heart as someone who spent a significant amount of time in Eastern Europe. The topic for tonight, holding Moscow accountable, war crimes against humanity and aggression in Ukraine, prospects for and problems of prosecution. It's the title we have chosen for the conversation, and we have 4 extraordinary panelists with us this evening. And my colleague, Deborah Prostine, Director of the Program in Law and Public Policy, has agreed to moderate the conversation. Our friend, a friend of our institute for decades, Ambassador Christian Venawasser, a permanent representative of the Principality of Liechtenstein to the United Nations, as well as our non-resident fellow, Professor of International Peace and Security and co-director of the War Crimes Research Group at King's College London, Professor James Gow. We have Olena Lennon, who is Ukrainian. She's an adjunct professor, practitioner in residence at the Department of National Security, Henry Seeley College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Sciences at the University of New Haven. And to my right, Eva Vukusic, Assistant Professor in International History at Utrecht University. She's been in The Hague for 15 years, working on this particular topic of crimes of aggression. And with that, perhaps I'll ask my colleague, Deborah Prostine, to begin the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. I'm delighted to see everyone here. And thank you so much to the Liechtenstein Center for asking me to do this. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation and looking forward to learning from this incredible group of panelists. We talked a little bit or emailed a little bit before about trying to keep this as conversational as possible. So I'm going to start by posing some questions. I'll start with questions for particular panelists, and then I'll open to questions that I'll invite all of the panelists to jump in on or comment on as they wish. But I want to make sure that we're not assuming knowledge, or actually two announcements. One is I'm told by our hosts that there will be a reception to follow over at the Liechtenstein Institute in Bentheim 19 in the MAP room at 6 p.m. So following this reception, this discussion, there'll be a reception. We can continue the conversation over there. But more important, I want to make sure that we're not assuming knowledge. I know there's a range of understandings of where we are in international law and even what it is. So, Professor, if I can start with you, just to help us with some terms. The title of the panel here is War Crimes, Crimes Against Humanity, Crime of Aggression in Ukraine, and Prospects for Prosecution. Can you help us just with the distinction between what counts as a war crime, what counts as a crime against humanity, what counts as a crime of aggression?
Thank you very much, Deborah, and thanks to all of you. If you can't hear me or tell what I'm saying at any point, do kind of shout and wave, or wag your ear. Anything else will do. You can't already. I don't know if this is even working. Is it working? Yeah. Okay, good. So people talk about war crimes, and they talk about terms like genocide quite frequently these days. They talk about them very much in political terms. They're used to attack one side or another, to claim support in one way or another. But it's important as we approach the prospect of prosecuting war crimes to understand the different types of things. At first, there are 2 broad bodies of law: international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and they sound quite the same, but they are distinct. One is more like a form of civil law, And whilst there's increasingly been overlap with international humanitarian law, that doesn't so much come into the direct prosecuting war crimes frame. But it does have some relevance, perhaps, for some of the things that we might talk about. In terms of international humanitarian law, the easiest place to start with is this Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, because that's the most up-to-date location for looking at any of this kind of stuff. And there are 4 crimes that can be charged. Those 4 crimes in the elements of the statute are actually different to when I was working with the Office of the Prosecutor at the Yugoslavia Tribunal, where my role as first witness was to introduce subject matter material to establish jurisdiction for the actual crimes. But they overlap. One of those is war crimes, and war crimes is divided into 2 components. One is treaty-based law, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, and that has specific features which are protected in international law, gives protection to people of certain kinds in certain contexts. And it's a very tightly controlled and understood form of law. And that's about the conduct of armed forces in conflict. The second element of war crimes is customary international law, which has a tradition building on ethics, moving through different kinds of legal agreements and discussions at different points in history. And it's a more flexible, more interpretable element. So in the courts that have been, the jurisprudence has been very much to take wide, expansive interpretations in relation to customary international law and the treatment of war crimes, while being very conservative about the treaty-based work of the Geneva Conventions. I mentioned genocide. Genocide is the specific intent to destroy a people in whole or in part, and I won't go too much further with that for now, except to say it has proved to be extremely difficult to convince courts of cases of genocide. I'm happy to go into that. If anybody is really interested, we can go backwards and forwards. And then the third element you mentioned there is crimes against humanity. And crimes against humanity doesn't have to appear in the context of war, though broadly it does, and it's been treated that way, with the exception of the Yugoslavia Tribunal, where a nexus with armed conflict was required. It doesn't have to be in the framework of war, but it does require either a widespread or a systematic context. So to explain, a murder becomes a murder in the context of war crimes or crimes against humanity if it's outside the normal day-to-day. The political conditions of war mean that the boundaries of that which is a crime change. There are still crimes, there are still rules that apply, but they apply at different levels and with different understandings. And a crime against humanity it can be murder, can be ethnic persecution, but it can't just be a single act. It has to be an act that is clearly part of a pattern and a process, either designated plan if you can find one, or at least you can see, well, this is happening lots of the time, the same things in different places, and therefore we can say this is definitely something that could be a crime against humanity, because it's the affront to humanity. And of course, that's the origin of any of this, really, in the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, where crimes against humanity, although it was attached to waging aggressive war, to very unpeaceful behavior, was the great innovation to confront the awfulness of the atrocities that we now call the Holocaust and what had happened under the Nazis. I hope that's a little bit of clarification. The fourth crime I haven't yet mentioned, I'm now going to hand over to Christian Veneweser, although I don't think he's been warned of this, because I can talk about the crime of aggression, but Christian led the working party that gave definition to the crime of aggression in the statute of the International Criminal Court. So I don't think anybody else should have the honor of talking about that bit of it.
That's fair enough. I will come back to you because I have a number of questions about the ICC and the current state of the crime of aggression, but just to help us fill out the sort of dictionary so we all know where we're talking about, right? The crime of aggression is something else entirely from war crimes and crimes against humanity, as we've just heard. Can you give us a working definition? In fact, I know you can.
Oh, I think he can.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for joining this evening. So yes, the crime of aggression is different from the other crimes. The other three crimes are often subsumed under the term atrocity crimes because they typically entail atrocities against individuals. Now, the crime of aggression is different in the sense that you could argue that the victim of this crime is actually international law, which is of course not entirely true. But the crime of aggression is something that an individual does to trigger a war, essentially. So war has been, except in a very narrowly defined circumstances, been illegal since 1945, you could argue, when we agreed on the Charter of the United Nations. That is the idea of creating the UN, was to make war illegal. So if you read the Charter, there's only 2 instances in which the use of force is not illegal. And these 2 instances are authorization by the Security Council of the United Nations. That means the organ in charge of collective security of the world, or self-defense. You always have the right to defend yourself. Every other use of force is illegal under international law. So it's always a breach of international law. That, as we all know, sadly is not what is reflected in the reality of our world. But it's very important that we all know and remind ourselves that all these wars that we're talking about, one way or the other, are very likely illegal in and of themselves. Now, the most obvious example is certainly the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. And that is a very blatant violation of the Charter of the United Nations. It's clearly an act of aggression, and it has been called an act of aggression by the General Assembly of the United Nations with overwhelming numbers. And that's very important because the General Assembly is the organ that decided and defined in 1970s what an act of aggression is. That means what it is that a state needs to do against another state for that act to qualify as aggression. Now, in a sense, this has remained in the hypothetical because it was a state act against the state. So the perpetrator, the culprit, is the state. But states don't just do things. There are individuals that lead to a decision that is made on behalf of the state. And that is where the crime of aggression comes in. So the crime of aggression is defined as a leadership crime. That means only persons in positions of political or military leadership qualify as perpetrators. So you have to be in a decision-making function inside your own state. That's typically the head of state. It's typically the foreign minister. It's typically the minister of defense. It can be other individuals, but it's not the person that drives a tank across the border. It's not the person that flies an airplane into the territory of the other state. These are not the people that commit aggression. Aggression are the people that are the political and military leaders. In addition to being a leadership crime, the crime of aggression is defined as the role that that person plays in committing the act of aggression, and that is planning and preparing and initiating an act of aggression. So these are the policy decisions that you make to commit an act of aggression that has to qualify as a manifest violation of the UN Charter by its character, gravity, and scale. So these are the defining elements of what the crime of aggression is. Now, this is a crime that has not been prosecuted since Nuremberg, and it has not been legally defined until 2010, and has not been valid law until 2017. So this is a relatively recent crime, a crime that, and I think it's nice to say that was in a way defined here in Princeton in a process that we held here in Princeton, and a law that I believe is of the utmost importance for the conversation we're having here. Because at the core of what we are seeing in Ukraine, and at the core of all the other crimes that James has talked about, the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that are undoubtedly being committed in Ukraine, is the war itself. So had the Russian leadership, or more precisely, had the president of the Russian Federation not decided to invade Ukraine, there would not be any war crimes today in Ukraine. There would not be any crimes against humanity in Ukraine, at least not in very large parts of Ukraine, because a part of Ukraine, of course, was occupied and under siege before. But I think it's extremely important to remind ourselves that actually the war itself is here, the crime that we need to be looking at, and everything else is actually a result of that war.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so we've gotten some basic definitions. This was a wonderful one. And now we need, if these are the offenses we're worried about, right? Everything from offenses against particular individuals to offenses essentially against the international political order, the legal political order. There are a range of institutions through which these can be pursued, right? So there is the ICC. We'll talk about developments there in just a minute. But particularly for war crimes types of offenses, at least, domestic criminal prosecution remains a major avenue. So I want to, as we just get sort of where we currently sit, or where things currently sit development-wise on the table, I want to turn to Dr. Lennon, if I can, and ask, are we seeing domestic criminal prosecutions of any kind in this space move forward in Ukraine? And then if you can say a word maybe about whether it's possible to comment on the sense in Ukraine about the relative importance of pursuing these offenses to the extent they can be through domestic courts, as opposed to, we'll talk about other international options here in just a minute.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here. This is a very important topic. I wish the circumstances would have been different for all of us to convene, but I very much appreciate the invitation, and it is my privilege to be amongst such experts. So first of all, I come at it as a political scientist mostly, and as a Ukrainian American. Obviously there's much more extensive legal expertise here on this panel, but I mainly focus on the intersection of law and politics, and look at Ukraine's domestic institutions and regional geopolitics. What I wanted to emphasize first, and kind of take a step back and kind of remind all of us here that as we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of the large-scale invasion, we're also coming up on a 10-year anniversary of the initial crime of aggression in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and also initiated an armed conflict in eastern Ukraine. So that way, war crimes have been piling up for at least 10 years now, at least. And that is also a reminder of how much politically the Russians have been pushing legal boundaries, but also testing our responses. The Russians have been testing Ukraine's response and testing the response of the West. And I think they've had a really long time to violate, to inflict this level of pain, but also test the responses and then proceed accordingly. So I think that in many ways, the large-scale invasion in 2022 was a result of impunity and lack of action and lack of accountability that originated in 2014, at least in 2014, not to mention various hybrid developments and hybrid warfare and things of that nature. So in terms of where Ukraine is at, I want to again emphasize that as much as Ukraine has been added since 2014, it wasn't until 2019 that Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine created a war crimes department. So it's a fairly new institution, and institutional capacity in Ukraine is fairly low, and obviously Ukrainians are now dealing with a lot of different challenges, and every single institution, every single organization is under a lot of strain, obviously subjected to aerial attacks, and there's mobilization in effect. So these are also Ukrainians who are in war and at war that are reporting to their daily work, whatever it is that they're doing. So Russians have committed a range of crimes in Ukraine, and we have heard definitions of the four main types of crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the mother of all crimes, crime of aggression, the leadership crime that has allowed all other crimes. And all four of those types of crimes have already been documented. There are multiple organizations, agencies working in Ukraine on the ground, documenting, investigating, helping Ukrainian judicial systems alleviate that burden. But what's important about that is that Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine currently has more than 100,000 crimes documented already. And I'll talk a little bit about what that number even means. And I know that probably to most people here it's just a number. But there are also about 24 countries that have sent some sort of a team, investigative team, to also do their own investigations and hopefully prosecutions as well. So as much as, again, the responsibility for serving justice to the perpetrators is ultimately mainly on Ukrainian courts, because it is the Ukrainian civilians who are victims of this aggression of war crimes. So the Ukrainian domestic courts are obviously, in a position to bear the brunt of that burden. The Prosecutor General's office, Andriy Kostyan's, has 9 regional offices, so they're spread across the country. As the war is still dynamic and continuing, they are completely overwhelmed with new evidence that is produced right now. But at the same time, as much as obviously it is mainly the Ukrainians' responsibility to investigate and prosecute, it is also of tremendous international concern because these crimes have already been established as universal crimes. And I think that this is really where it's important to recognize that even though there's no international mechanism to prosecute leaders in Moscow, to prosecute crime of aggression in any sort of uniform way, there are still some tools at our disposal, and I'll list some of them. But given the sheer number of war crimes documented already, Ukrainians and the Office of Prosecutor General, Andriy Kostyan's, prioritized 3 areas: the forced deportation of children, which is also genocidal in nature, which is the main and the gravest crime that has been inflicted on Ukrainians, and it continues. Sexual violence, and the third one is genocide. That said, Ukrainians have also prioritized prosecution of crime of aggression itself, right, as the mother of all crimes and as a leadership crime, to actually hold perpetrators in Moscow responsible, those who planned, prepared, initiated, or executed a military action on Ukraine. So there is a sense of urgency, despite the fact that there's an overwhelming number of cases. But the signals from Ukraine are such that they invite international investigative teams and they invite international prosecutors, not only because to burden share, not only because it's obviously it will help Ukraine alleviate some of the burden on institutions and also highlight the scale of atrocities, but also because Ukraine is signaling very strongly that these crimes, if left with impunity, if the perpetrators are not served justice, then ultimately the international legal system is going to be even more weakened, because this is a matter of deterrence. That the only way to create any sense of a stable peace is to ensure that crime of aggression is prohibitively costly. That it is, ultimately, Ukraine sees itself as being an important, but perhaps the most important actor right now in creating a legal order centered on prohibition of aggression for deterrence effect. But it is, of course, and that's why it is of universal importance and universal recognition. But another reason why Ukrainians invite international prosecutors to also try cases of war crimes and crime of aggression is because in many ways, as Zelensky said many times, that no peace without justice, that victims a country that is torn by war. And then, full disclosure, I am from Eastern Ukraine originally, and my hometown has been occupied since 2014. And I know personally of the existence of torture camps that were set up in that area, and some of my friends unfortunately had to go through that experience. And at that time, nobody was paying attention because it was on a small scale. And unfortunately, these are the same crimes that are on a larger scale, but the nature of the crime has not changed. So ultimately, this is also about international security and international deterrence mechanism. So in terms of where, how successful the Ukrainian judicial system has been and why the international teams are so critical is that given how much the Russians have been leveraging international law against Ukraine and have been pushing those boundaries, Ukraine is also perceived as party to conflict. Ukrainians are perceived as biased in the eyes of the international system, and that is completely understandable. That is also why Ukrainian, the Office of the Prosecutor General and the multiple, I believe they have 200 prosecutors working on international crimes in particular. I hope it's not my timer. If so, that would be completely fair. I'm wrapping up, I promise. So if the importance of international prosecutors and investigators is also in establishing international legitimacy. That it's not just Ukrainians prosecuting Russians, right? Because the Ukrainians are also victims. That the crime of aggression and other types of war crimes in the context of an armed conflict are universal in nature, and that international legitimacy is established that way. So Ukraine currently has so crime of aggression is also a domestic crime, a crime by national law of Ukraine. Article 437 in particular of Criminal Code of Ukraine and Article 110 specifically pertain to international crime. So Article 437 prohibits crime of aggression, and currently Office of Prosecutor General has 170 suspects identified as in violation of Ukraine's law against the crime of aggression. Among them are leaders of the Russian Federation's parliament, chief of the General Staff, Gerasimov, also Minister of Defense Shoigu, heads of intelligence, and other military commanders. So currently, again, there is enough evidence to provide an official notice of suspicion to them. In terms of the violation of territorial integrity, which is Article 110 of Ukraine's criminal code, there are currently 700 suspects. Among them are almost every single member of the Russian parliament, of the Duma, that are suspected of violating this particular article. Of that, number of almost 1,200 people that are now documented suspects, only a small portion of them, approximately 300, have been issued indictments, and only about 60 soldiers have been convicted and sentenced. So it's obviously a drop in the ocean. Another thing that complicates these matters that Ukraine relies on frequent prisoner of war exchanges. The majority of these cases are tried in absentia. Only less than 10% of current suspected or indicted war criminals are currently in Ukrainian courts, and most of them are prisoners of war. However, prisoners of war exchanges are frequent among the Russians and Ukrainians. Ukrainians also rely on this important vehicle of returning their own prisoners of war. And so one of the challenges that the Prosecutor General faces is preventing indicted and convicted war criminals from being exchanged for Ukrainian prisoners of war. It's a very complicated dilemma. So far, one Russian soldier has been convicted of war crimes in Ukraine, was actually returned back to Russia as part of the prisoner of war exchanges. That is not ideal, but again, sometimes those difficult political decisions have to be made. So among the challenges that, and I'll finish on this note, that Ukrainians are facing right now, other than the sheer number of cases, is that international law prohibits immunity, prohibits prosecution of foreign heads of state. The only such person that was the only person who was actually convicted of crime of aggression and violation of Ukraine's sovereignty is Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine, who was sentenced to 13 years in prison. He was the only leader who was convicted because he's a Ukrainian citizen. Now, the challenge that Ukraine's judicial system faces is that even though Ukraine's law allows trials in absentia that are frowned upon by international law, which I'm sure my colleagues will dwell upon, that even though Yanukovych has been convicted, it doesn't prevent him from enjoying his life in Russia, it seems. So those are the limitations. Ukraine can prosecute and try in absentia, but unfortunately, international law provides immunity to heads of state, and therefore the ultimate perpetrators, people in the Kremlin who gave orders, are immune at this point, unless they travel to a country that will that is party to ICC and that will agree to extradite them. And I hear that Armenia was one of the latest to join the ICC, and it's not implausible that Putin will travel to Armenia, but we'll see. And on a final note, I just want to very, very briefly talk about Russia itself. And I think it's pretty obvious to everybody here that there's no doubt that the Russian leaders are behind in planning and initiating these attacks. But what's also, I think, breaks those norms is the fact that not only do the Russians break international law, but currently the current administration actively encourages war crimes. So, and this is a bigger conversation of how much violence is instrumentalized and part of Russia's strategic culture, military culture. It is violence as a tool, and rules of engagement are very loose. But I'll mention just two facts. In December of 2022, the Russian parliament adopted a bill that would provide immunity for certain war crimes committed by the Russian military in occupied parts of Ukraine. That is how the Russian military governs those territories, so they actually enjoy immunity from it. And the second point is that recently Putin actually awarded the 64th Motorized Brigade that committed crimes, the first batch of crimes that was revealed in Bucha, Irpin, outside Kiev, the very brigade that the Ukrainians already documented evidence that had committed summary executions, torture, and indiscriminate killing of civilians. The same very brigade, upon return to Russia, received medals for bravery and esteemed honor, and their brigade was upgraded elevated to the status of Guard Motorized Brigade, which is kind of elite status. So that just completes the picture of what we're dealing with. It's not just disregard of international law, but converting violence into an illegal instrument of political power. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much. That was wonderfully comprehensive and daunting. I want to turn, before we begin asking broader questions, to Professor Vikusic. Thank you for being here. Okay, so enormous challenges with domestic prosecution happening anyway, right, to some extent. But there are obviously international options. The ICC is one. There are a history post-Nuremberg, pre-ICC, which isn't really born until 2002, right? Other options, including in the former Yugoslavia. How do you think about, or maybe can you tell us a little bit about the legal complexities of pursuing either the ICC type prosecutions here or an ad hoc tribunal? And then I'll turn back finally to Professor Vinevisser for a state of play on where things currently are.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I want to say that I'm really honored to be on such an esteemed panel. So let me start by saying that I'm a historian, and I'm also a client of international justice. I was born and raised in the former Yugoslavia. I live in the Netherlands now for something like 15 years, so I'm also a little bit Dutch, but I also see myself very much as a client of international justice. One thing that I would also say is that kind of my comments are going to come from, I guess, two places. One is that I've spent something like a decade watching trials at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, so the ICTY is the acronym that I will use, day in and day out. So for example, the case of Radovan Karadzic, Ratko Mladic, so I've really seen them kind of play out slowly the way they do in real time. So I want to start by saying that justice, even on its best days, is slow, imperfect, requires political will, knowledge, and expertise, and significant resources. So this is something that in Ukraine and in other places in the world, it is something that we really must commit to, and we need to think of in terms of decades, not years. Prosecutions also do not take place in a vacuum. So political developments in Ukraine, but also the situation on the battlefield, who wins elections here and in other places in the world will play a role. Because if we want to acknowledge it or not, prosecutions depend on money, and money depends on political decisions to allocate money, for example. So that's, I think, an important point. Just to put things into perspective, so we're now about 30 years after the war crimes investigations and prosecutions started for the former Yugoslavia and the ICTY, so the tribunal in The Hague, and domestic jurisdictions, so courts around the former Yugoslavia, altogether prosecuted a little bit over 1,000 people. These are not in absentia cases, so these are in-person trials. So just to put things into perspective, of course, we mentioned the well-known number of over 100,000 alleged cases. So just to put things into perspective, though, that's a little bit what we are looking at in terms of what is sort of possible. The Ukraine, of course, does not have a special tribunal or the ad hoc tribunal like we had in the former Yugoslavia. It has the ICC, and there the options are even smaller. Like even on the best days, that we can consider one or two cases might play out at the International Criminal Court, and that's it, simply because they have too much work and they're not there to serve only Ukraine. And also, of course, we have the arrest warrants against Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, but prospects for arrest are very up in the air, and kind of we don't really know what's going to happen there. So it's frustrating and it's difficult to acknowledge this, but out of 100,000 alleged cases, most of these people are going to walk free. I mean, that's just the reality of it, and I think it's best acknowledged and managed as opposed to dreamt away in some way. So I think it's really important that we look at which trials are possible, what are the best ways of trying to organize them to some standards of fair trial proceedings, and to make sure that we try to pick the best trials and the best sort of prepared cases to go further. One, I think, a lesson also, if I can call it that, is that outreach and communication is really important. And I don't necessarily think that that is going on very well in Ukraine at the moment, which I can understand. They're a country at war. They need to keep their spirits up. But things like saying every war criminal is going to get prosecuted, they're not. I mean, they're just not in the context of a traditional courtroom. Maybe in some other fora, like, for example, the Gacaca proceedings in Rwanda might be some, adjustment, but in a traditional courtroom, 100,000 alleged cases, like there's no way 5% of that or 10% of that is going to come to a courtroom. So I want to just say that they can only do so much, and the limits are harsh and brutal. And I think it's really important to understand that there are other complementary mechanisms that we need to think about. And I think a lot of attention, for good reason, goes to criminal prosecutions. And I, as a former Yugoslav, but also as a professional, am a big supporter. But there's big limits to that, to that effort, which I was just sort of trying to kind of emphasize. And just one or two points to end. In that light, I think ambitions about what is possible should be realistic and in line with the local judiciary. So what can Ukraine do? And we mentioned a little bit, there is incredible investment and engagement from 2014, but even much more so from the full-scale invasion. But in some ways, some of that may there's a lot of documenting by 1,000 organizations, but there's not a lot of coordination. So I wonder, is there going to be trials and prosecutions that can't necessarily use all of that because no one has any idea of what is out there in terms of potential evidence? So there's also dangers in having so many actors doing trainings, documentation, and just all kinds of activities in Ukraine. So I think there's also dangers in sort of this massive involvement that we have seen in Ukraine. And just finally on the point of the 100,000 alleged cases, and I think it's very much true that the bulk of it is going to have to be dealt with by Ukraine, simply because the ICC will have no capacity, and there's no path for like a special tribunal for Ukraine. Well, maybe on aggression, we'll see that. But for the crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, we are not looking at a special ad hoc tribunal, for example, like for the former Yugoslavia. So when you're looking at the pile of 100,000 alleged cases, I want to ask one question, which is unclear to me. What is a case? We don't really have any. Is this like one piece of paper that says, on this at this day, a shell fell in this town and killed 7 people, but we don't really know which unit shot it and from where? So, or do we have more? Because they're trying to develop a strategy as to how to go about dealing with 100,000 cases. But even if the best strategy in the world, if you don't have good enough data to apply it to, it might be really difficult and sort of challenging. So what are, looking forward, what are the criteria for prioritizing cases? Out of 100,000, how do you say this 5,000 is what we're going for right now, and everything else we just need to park for the time being because it's simply not realistic? Even with the support and the assistance, it's just not realistic that you can work on 100,000 cases or even 10,000. We had 10,000 in Bosnia, and we're still, far from being done. So these are some of the lessons, I would say, and also some of the challenges to domestic prosecutions in Ukraine looking sort of forward.
Thank you so much. So Ambassador, where are we, I suppose I should say, on the crime of aggression, given all these sort of extraordinary challenges and the particular challenges around the crime of aggression? And then I want to ask some broader questions and invite folks to comment on what we've heard so far.
Well, I think we're not in a very good place right now, because the reality is that Ukraine is under enormous pressure right now. It's probably the most difficult moment for Ukraine today since February 2022. And you all read the papers and you know why. So the biggest challenge that Ukraine has is to try to continue its defense, its military defense against the invasion in a successful way, and that is far from guaranteed right now. And I think for the Ukrainian leadership, number 1, 2, and 3 priority is securing support. That is financial, that is military, and that is political, and that is declining. This particular project, to have a special tribunal on the crime of aggression, is extremely important, but it's not on the top of the agenda right now. So if you're President Zelensky, and he has been very consistent in this, and he has been very courageous, and he has been saying these things against, knowing that some of his supporters don't want him to say this. And I really want to pay tribute to him, but it cannot possibly be his highest priority right now. So the question is, what do we do? What is our response? And I really think this is a unique opportunity and challenge for all of us. Because, this is an aggression against one country. It's an aggression against Ukraine, but it in fact is an assault on our legal order. So it does affect all of us. So it's not about Ukraine only. And if we miss this opportunity to say this kind of war making can never reoccur, then we're actually encouraging it. And, Olena has talked about 2014. Our response in 2014 is part of the reason why we're talking about 2022. Because our response to 2014 was so lackluster and was so terrible that in fact encouraged the Russian leadership to do it again at a larger scale. And I think that's the lesson for us here. And if we miss this opportunity to say you cannot aggress your neighbor or any other country the way you are doing it and get away with it, then we will have really missed something extremely important that goes far, far, far beyond Ukraine. And I think that's the moment we find ourselves in. And I don't think our response is particularly good. This is, legally it's a challenge, but it's more a political challenge because many of, our partners, many of our allies find it very difficult to say we have to make war itself illegal, and that means we have to hold the political leaders accountable. I think the first person convicted in the Ukrainian court was this Russian soldier who shot this cyclist in Bucha because the guy next to him in the car said, shoot this guy. And after he told him 3 times, shoot this guy, he shot him. So this is the first person that was convicted in a Ukrainian court. Now, am I saying he shouldn't have been convicted? No, totally no. He should have been convicted. But does anyone think that that is justice? Also no. Because we all know who is responsible for the war, and we all know that these are the people that should be in a court of law, and not not the guy who shot the cyclist. And I think that is very important for us to keep in mind. So, there are crimes for which there is no reparation for genocide. There is no reparation for torture. There is no reparation for crimes against humanity. So you're victimized forever by that, and those, close to you are. But there can be a sense of justice, and I think for many victims, a very important aspect is simply that the truth is told, that the story is told, what happened to them. Not so much that guy goes to jail for 5 years. That's also important, but that's the importance of trials, and that's the importance of this, and this is why the story needs to be told, and this is why we need to take this opportunity to really criminalize the war itself, not only what happened as part of the war.
So there's so much to dig into here. I want to both just open it up and give folks a chance to respond to things the other panelists have said, but let me frame a question just coming off of what the ambassador was just saying, right? So, one argument, and it's a classic debate in international criminal justice, is given, especially in this context, right, just a blatant violation of the UN Charter, the crime of aggression, and the clear, apart from the legal complexities, unbelievable political challenges facing here, if the goal is storytelling, for example, getting the truth out, right, there are mechanisms for doing that are short of criminal prosecution and that don't entail the unbelievable resource-intensive and legal challenges associated with criminal prosecution. How do we think about how to prioritize not just particular cases, but the cause of international criminal justice and the mechanism of international criminal justice, as opposed to other forms of solution, whether they're political solutions or whether they're different kinds of non-criminal sort of activities. I don't know, Professor Gao, do you want to start? Because I know you had you wanted to respond to some other things earlier, but you can take up whatever you wish.
Thanks, Deborah. There are no end of things to respond to the things we've heard already. And, on this point about narratives, one of the great initial things about the Yugoslavia Tribunal, and I witnessed this, is the way in which people initially, victims coming to the court, would feel that this was something happening. Their story was being heard. People wanted to know. That, over time, transformed into a strong degree of disaffection, with a sense that the process hadn't worked, that justice hadn't been done. So it's a really difficult tension always between the idea of getting things out there, of having stories to be told, of getting people to feel that things have been told, but at the same time, still giving them the sense of justice. Initially, it seems like it's a sense of justice. After time, when certain things have happened, but not the way they thought they would, or have not happened, there's a different perspective. And when you noted, I wanted to pick up when Eva was saying about the 100,000 cases and the 10,000 cases. What is a case is a really important question. I started out by saying people allege war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide all over the place. But if you're taking it serious, you were pointing in terms of international criminal justice, it's a very different tale. To get the kind of evidence to build a case, as well as getting witnesses involved, is quite a challenge. and you certainly can't do 100,000 or 10,000 that way. But I also expect that of the 100,000, actually only a very small number in the end could ever be court ready. Not because something wrong was or wasn't done, but because of the nature of the criminal judicial process and the requirements of that in terms of investigation, analysis, putting things together, having chains of control of pieces of evidence that will satisfy a court beyond reasonable doubt, that it will be a kind of a probity, it will be of value to judges in a way that they can form a decision. But that said, I'm still lots of doubts, lots of problems I can see, but I'm still a great fan and proponent of international criminal justice, and I believe it is a right thing to do, and it should be pushed, no matter what the difficulties, and there are considerable difficulties here. The key difficulty, Christian Ambassador Venevieza spoke about the leadership. The key difficulty, whatever the crime, doesn't matter which bit of crime we're talking about, if it's the leadership, the key starting point difficulty is how do you get them into a court? And that's not obvious. From where we are now, it's particularly lacking in any clear route. At the same time, people said the same things about some of the leaders in the Yugoslav lands. And over time, pretty much all of them ended up in the courtroom. So we can look with patience to a time ahead when maybe the political circumstances will be different. And at that moment, all kinds of other things might happen. One of my favorites is the idea that maybe Russia would take responsibility for its own. I'm not saying it's terribly likely, but Olena pointed to the elements in the Ukrainian criminal code. Article 353 of the Russian criminal code specifically identifies waging aggressive war as a crime. The easiest way to prosecute these people would be under the Russian criminal code, if ever that came to be a possibility. Now, we recognize that Putin runs the leadership as a mafia boss. Therefore, the idea of people turning on him is not to be anticipated too much. We can be sure that there will be people unhappy with what's going on with him, but they'll be very afraid to whisper to other people, let alone to turn around and do something, because the record shows an awful lot of people have gone out of windows, have gone under cars, have been poisoned, and so you're not likely to turn. But over time, things can change. And if things can change, then maybe other things could happen. And again, I'm not saying any of this will happen, but it's important, for instance, that the moment when change comes, Russia will be different. Maybe that's a Russia which will cooperate within the Security Council again. Yeah? This act of wholly unwarranted use of armed force to try to occupy a country has only one recent precedent, which was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, at which point the Security Council was cooperating and worked in the way the UN was intended to work, more or less, and dealt with that issue. Because Russia is a permanent member, has a veto, that can't happen. When, if Russia changes, maybe its approach to using the veto on questions will change. Maybe it'll find it convenient, as did Serbia over Slobodan Milosevic, to send him to an international court to get him off their hands, to get rid of the problem. Again, I don't say they will, but we have to be patient and we have to look at what the options are. And in that context, I think it's important to say, well, there could be a Security Council reference at that point to the ICC, with particular mechanisms and realms to deal with things, not an ad hoc tribunal, but an ad hoc reference, which is within the Security Council's capabilities to do that. It could be that the indictment that's been issued, and I think the indictment that's issued is terribly important, not only because it's the first time anybody's ever put a focus on children in itself, but it's children under forcible displacement, but because the prosecutor has framed a case that is as close to simple and open and shut as could be. Now, I recognise all these cases have immense difficulties, but it's one where Putin and Belova have been indicted because they've been on television talking about the alleged crimes. He's been congratulating her on what they've done. It's very hard to imagine what the defence against this would be. Of course, there will be defences. And it's also framed in a way that we're coming up to the anniversary of the indictment, and I wouldn't be at all surprised, again, I'm not saying definitely it will happen, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if we then get a further confirmation hearing, at which point the situation will become very different if Putin ever were to come into context, because it would then go straight to trial. There would be no pre-trial proceedings. But these are all immensely difficult stuff. And with all of that, we might even get to aggression, if any of that were to happen.
So I want to make sure that we have time. It's wonderful credit. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So, but let me ask one more, and just for anyone in the panel to respond to briefly if they want. You know, because I would be remiss in not asking. We're sitting here in an American university. The United States has had, to put it mildly, a fraught relationship with international criminal justice, international criminal courts. Certainly the United States is not a party to the Rome Statute. In the past, we've had the US governments under various administrations have worked very actively to thwart its activities. There seems to be more cooperation at the moment. We had a talk here at the beginning of the semester, beginning of last semester, by Ken Roth, former director of Human Rights Watch, who was remarkably sanguine about the U.S. role at the moment. Given the challenges and the necessity for leadership, are you seeing from the United States something that's categorically different, something that's helpful, that's not counterproductive? What is the U.S. best role under these circumstances?
I would like to talk, but I've talked a lot.
Yeah, so
Can I or not?
well, so let me give the others a chance, and then we'll come back to you if not.
Sure, I can start. I'm an academic, I can say whatever I want. No, so just to say, I mean, like many other states in the world, right? Often they approach problems like this in a very, pragmatic, self-interested way. I would say on Ukraine, the United States has been very actively and positively involved and has provided a lot of assistance and support for various NGOs and initiatives and trainings and experts and all of that. And the former Yugoslavia as well, a lot of effort with very positive results. And I really, as James, I'm critical, but also a big proponent and a big supporter. However, I think that there are issues where it appears that there's a lack of consistency and there's double standards about, for example, it's not a problem to indict Putin, even though the United States previously, I believe, long held a position that if you're not a state's party, then you should not be, engaging with that state, right? So I think it doesn't appear credible, and in some ways as well, if you want to be a leader in the space of international justice, join the Rome Statute. If you want others to submit to a system, be part of the system. Otherwise, how are you a credible partner? So I think this exceptionalism, I mean, I don't know. I'm from two small countries, so maybe that's a position that that sort of is in my mind as I say this. But if you want to be a credible partner, join the Rome Statute. That will, I think, elevate your credibility and your position with regards to the International Criminal Court, but also more broadly, international justice as a system, as an effort.
Nadia, did you have a point?
Just one comment, maybe to more credible partners, European allies. Are there any European governments that are pursuing universal jurisdiction cases against Russian war crimes as a supplemental to the very slow ICC?
I'm happy to say just a couple of words. Germans are very famous for conducting structural investigations. There are other European partners, and I'm sure colleagues on the panel know more. But yes, very much the universal jurisdiction is a practice, I would say, in the last decade or so, I think really emerged and grew. And I mean, at the end of the day, it is still only a drop in the bucket, so to say, because they can only do just a few cases. But it can help, right? It can help. Yeah, it's meaningful, exactly.
I just want to speak a little bit kind of more generally to this idea of, there's so many teams, there's so many countries that are investigating, and Eva very rightfully said that sometimes it actually can overwhelm the system even more. Some of the problems there that re-traumatization of victims, that a lot of the same people get interviews over and over again. There's a lot of documentation and witnesses of these crimes tend to be interviewed by multiple teams. So Ukraine is actually working on coordinating all these multiple efforts. It's one of the priorities, and facilitating and coordinating, making sure that there's no duplication, because that could be equally traumatizing. But I will say, though, that regardless of how inefficient sometimes it may seem, that in international relations and international justice, unity is currency. And currently, any opportunity to signal unity, that it's a collective effort, that it's a, call it, the proverbial West, or, the democratic world, or the global North, whatever the cliche or the label might be. But currently, Ukraine relies on unity, and even the impression to whoever they signal to that it matters to more than just Ukraine, that the West is, democracies are united, that they're not giving up on Ukraine, because that unity will be converted into political leverage, and it is currency. So I would say that it's still important that these attempts are made, and however inefficient. And yes, evidence doesn't expire, war crimes don't expire, even 100 years from now, the perpetrators could be brought to justice, but it's still an active war. It's still a hot war. Witnesses get killed. People are killed every day. So, the longer we wait, the less there is opportunity to serve justice. And I think that hence the sense of urgency there. And lastly, I think what's important to Ukraine to signal right now with all this effort is that, what distinguishes Ukraine from Russia is precisely rule of law. That Ukraine positions itself as a rule-oriented country that does everything transparently, that sees itself as part of the European Western community, that will meticulously prosecute and investigate every single crime, however resource intensive it might be, because it's a matter of principle, it's a matter of following the rules and doing things transparently. And again, it's currency. For Ukraine now, every opportunity to kind of earn that credibility is precisely what distinguishes it from Russia, and reminds and galvanizes Ukrainians around this idea that we are doing things by the rules, we're transparent, because that is also important. And defense procurement and all these other corruption scandals that unfortunately also proliferate. And lastly, I agree with James completely that in years' time, with proper incentives, Russia, it has survived sanctions, and its defense industrial capacity is on the rise again. They have found ways to rebuild and rearm and restrike. But that said, they're still struggling economically. It's a wartime economy. And I think that there will be more sanctions and confiscation of Russian property. So in years' time, when Putin is no longer, and maybe somebody worse than Putin, but nonetheless, I think the West collectively could offer the right incentives to the Russian opposition, whoever are the successors to Putin, that the only way, if they wanted to get international loans, if they wanted international legitimacy, if they wanted to rebuild their country, they will have to prosecute war crimes. And whatever that means. I think the West has still a lot of untapped power and leverage, that there's still a lot of room for risk-taking that I think the US has not taken advantage of. I understand national interest trumps that, but the US has had very low threshold for risk appetite, and they haven't tapped into all their potential to leverage that power, economic power included, against Russia.
Yeah, so I wanted to, is this a question or you want to add a comment? Okay, so yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you know what? I can't say no to you. Yes, please, Wolfgang.
Oh dear.
First of all, thank you for doing this, and this is wonderful. And it's particularly touching for me to see someone with whom together we lived the entire Balkan crisis, and also with everything that we exchanged now. Just a quick thing, because we've discussed this in my classes so much. Old rules, no rules, my rules, new rules. criminal justice on a global scale should be global. We are today faced, any one of us who is in international organizations, that I'm reminded on the word of Joschka Fischer, the West against the rest against the rest. When we had the fear of sealed indictments, the height of the ICTY, this was a period after the fall of the Berlin Wall in the 1990s, where you had Pol Pot, where you had mass killings in Africa, and where you had a successful liberation of Kuwait. And you had the feeling now this disaster of an inactive war within Yugoslavia can just go unpunished, cannot. There was this general thing, you have to do something. By all, I've not heard a single person say, ICT by now. I don't think you will have that today. I had to discuss with some diplomat saying, you do the rules for one side, and you don't do them for the other. And how do you want to answer that in February 2024? So, how do you want to, Christian, this goes very much to you also. You know how much I believe in the ICC. We're really joint host for 5 years here at the ICC. How are we creating trust and credibility and transparency, believing into a new international order?
Do you want to address that? Or you don't have to.
Yeah, well, I'm not here speaking on behalf of the ICC, but maybe the address is also your question in a way. I believe in the end it's, in a way, it's relatively simple. So if you believe there is a law, and if you want that law to be applied, you have to ask that the law is applied consistently. And that is what we're not doing right now. Or that is what many of us are not doing. So you also have to say it if it's difficult for you, and if it's painful for you, and if it, if it affects the people that you don't want it to affect. And, otherwise, the law is not, is just not what it can be, and it's not worth it, because then the law becomes a perceived policy tool of some people. It's like, well, the law is convenient for you if you can use it against the right people, and you ignore it when it would be applied to the wrong people. And I think that is what it comes down to. So the law has to be applied consistently, and there is no, and we are the advocates, so we have to ask for that. We as states have to ask for that. That doesn't mean that you in this room don't have to ask for it. You also have to do it. But I think it comes down to that, and that is how you build trust. Because if you have a court where people believe, well, they may go after perpetrator A, but they're certainly not going to go after perpetrator B, because that's going to lead to a lot of backlash, and it's going to put them under a lot of pressure, then people do not have the trust that you're talking about.
Let me make sure we have an opportunity for folks to ask questions. So I'd ask you, if you have questions, just raise your hand and keep your question brief, and I'll ask the panelists the same. If you keep your answers brief, we'll get through more. Yes,
Deborah,
please.
can I suggest that we gather them all in and then have
Yeah.
one final comeback?
I think that makes great sense.
Yeah.
So let's take and we can take notes. You can borrow my pen.
That's fine. I have a copy of your pens.
Oh,
Thank you very
good.
much. You're very kind.
Not at all. Please, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, this was wonderful. I was wondering also about the role and so for collaborationism, for example, is there a space for that within the international justice, like criminal justice system, or is it purely something that would be persecuted on the domestic side? Because we definitely see persecutions of collaborationists already, but is there a space for that also on the international side?
Great. Other questions? Yes.
On that issue of consistency, the whole reason created ICC was to sort of place these ad hoc tribunals in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. So don't you think current debate on a potential international tribunal for Ukraine sort of delegitimizes the ICC in the sense that it undermines the whole reason that we created this organization? I wouldn't sort of using this unity for Ukraine to sort of amend the Kampala agreement and sort of make the aggregation of the ICC jurisdiction be a better route to pursue consistent national justice?
Very good. Yes.
This is a clarifying question on aggression specifically. What about aggression that is perpetrated by leaders of non-state actors, and how does that complicate things, thinking militias, etc.?
Yeah.
It's just an addition to this question. Maybe Professor Guy, you can expand. I know you mentioned that categories of aggression was character over the gravity of it and scale of it. What is it?
I think that was Ambassador Villavesa, but I wouldn't dissent from that. Yeah.
What does it mean for one element to have more gravity than the other? How would you characterize the gravity of the current invasions in 2014 or something like that?
As compared to 2014?
Or any other?
And did you, yeah, go ahead.
I'll do a second one, which is basically, as a child of a family defined by trauma of genocide, what do you see as some of the possible implications of ongoing issues of trauma? And you briefly discussed re-traumatizing victims, and how does that affect the policy views of what should go on as this continues?
These are wonderful questions and a huge range as well. So I think let me stop and maybe just invite, we'll go down the row. You can pick which ones you'd like to respond to or not, and see how we do.
Thank you for your questions. Wonderful questions indeed. Collaborationism, actually, this is one of the other main areas where the Ukrainian system is completely overwhelmed. And the Office of Prosecutor General is also handling all of that. Ukraine has recently updated its laws on collaborationism. They have become a lot more strict. You know, there's a wider range of what constitutes collaborationism. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but let's just say that is definitely in domestic jurisdiction. I'm not sure how internationally it's handled, but I think Ukraine probably bears the brunt of that burden. But it's also very controversial, so I would doubt that international jurisdiction would apply there. You know, on trauma, it's a big question, but that is precisely why Ukrainians are so adamant about, regardless of how many years it takes and resources that it will take, is because people need closure, and Ukrainians are so traumatized by the daily experiences. The most current poll showed that now half of Ukrainians report knowing somebody who was killed or having a member of the family. So you can imagine the level of direct trauma, and justice brings closure. So people can't heal, and Ukrainians have to rebuild whoever is left will eventually have to rebuild the country. So it's also currency, you know, it is not, these are not soft subjects, you know, these are very, very, real things that require, as part of the healing process for people to remain functional. And just lastly, I will say that on I think there was a question, what was the other question? Oh, on war of aggression. I think ultimately, you're right. If we get into the granularity, right, as far as whether it's non-state actors or states, then it almost defeats the purpose of the universal consistency and universal nature of using aggression as a political tool. And ultimately, I think sometimes people ask, and you saw this with the Zaluzhny, when Zelensky fired, his chief general, the commander of the armed forces. One of the things that I think sometimes Western audiences don't understand is that the reason Ukrainians are fighting for every single village, and sometimes Western military advisors say there's no need to throw so many resources and capabilities to defend Bakhmut or Avdiivka. In a strategic sense, they may not matter. But the reason military strategy meets political strategy is precisely because of war crimes. The reason they're fighting to liberate every single village is because they already saw, the world saw, how the Russians govern in those villages. And this translates into how political decisions are made.
On the question of gravity, and I'm sure Christian will come back more on this, I think in terms of aggression, the idea of introducing gravity is just to be clear that, so one military patrol goes 500 meters into a country. Is that an act of aggression? It's probably not grave enough to warrant invoking the ideas of aggression. And that's a tiny example, but just to give a sense that you need something which is going to be of sufficient weight and substance to be clear that giving it that name and introducing it into the process in that way is going to be worthwhile. And that means that there's going to be a degree of interpretation. One of the things you find through all of these criminal processes is that there's an awful lot of interpretation goes on in courts. Different trial chambers, different judges will give different readings of some of the same kinds of evidence. I mean, there's broad consistency, but just as a troubling example, I'll give you the jurisprudence on genocide, which troubles me very greatly. Because the jurisprudence has come to a point on genocide where it says the only way to prove the crime, and I'll remind you what I said earlier, the crime is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a protected people. In fact, the judges have decided that the only way to deal with intent is to have a substantial, and they have these substantiality threshold tests, which looks like it's kind of around 5,000 proven cases that will go in the context of genocide, as the only way to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the intent was actually to destroy in whole or in part. But the crime is the intent. In theory, you could prosecute somebody for intending to do it, even if they didn't manage the partial attempted destruction of one person. So that troubles me greatly, because it also means in the Yugoslavia context, where I was heavily engaged, the tribunal closed in 2017 without reaching a single genocide conviction in relation to the events in northern Bosnia, especially around a place called Prijedor in 1992, which gave rise to the tribunal because of all the reports and allegations of genocide. So this whole venture was created because of the allegations, the reports of genocide, and yet the court closed its doors without a single conviction for those events. Genocide was found in relation to events at Srebrenica. We don't have time to go into the ins and outs between the two things, but I find that troubling. But the gravity question is linked to this because it's about the substantiality of the events that you're treating. And in that context, I think it's worth addressing the court, which I think you were referring to the idea of creating a special court for aggression, which has been very popular up to a certain point by some member states in the EU and by a lot of activist international criminal lawyers. It's a very difficult question. Personally, I'm sceptical of it because of the notion of victor's justice. It would be returning to the tales of victor's justice. And when we're going to have to deal with Russia afterwards, that may just make things too complicated. At the same time, pace what Ambassador Venebeza has said earlier, there's something here that it's just too big to ignore. So I don't know where we go on that. My ideal would be that somehow Russia would change. It would refer the crime of aggression in cooperation to the prosecutor at the ICC, and it would be dealt with there with different mechanisms, which would require Security Council resolution because it couldn't be dealt with because they don't have jurisdiction for aggression at the moment anyway. So it would mean some special measures that would have to involve Russia. Is that likely? Can't say, probably not. Implications of trauma. Yeah, there's too much trauma in all of this, and it's too big and difficult to try to answer, I'm afraid, right now. It's subject matter problems. I have two things to say at the end. I've been waiting to come back to say. One is to keep in mind a distinction between war, which is political phenomenon, and armed conflict. which is the application of restrained coercive violence, which can be within the context of war. The crimes apply to the armed conflict, to the use of armed force, to the decisions to use them in the way that we use them. And it's important always when we're trying to deal with the complexity of this to keep in mind that war itself, mutatis mutandis, is not unlawful. What's unlawful is breaching the rules that go along with it and those that are codified. And in that context, I think Ukraine has every right to continue its armed conflict. And I expect that in some circumstances that is what happened. I would be confident that eventually, through armed action, it would regain pretty much, if not all, the occupied territory. But the question, coming back to trauma and other matters as well, is would it be worth the cost when perhaps there will be a point reached where you can do something differently and achieve it in the longer term in different ways. And here I point to Federal Republic of Germany, called 5 Länder, occupied for 40 years, but eventually restored. Over time, things can change and can be different, but that takes a lot of patience, and sometimes people kind of not willing to have that. But it's meeting the circumstances and saying, are you really prepared to pay the cost that doing that would entail, which it would. And the final point, we heard about you asked about the United States, and we had a chance. There is no greater force in international law and no greater force in international criminal justice than the United States. And nobody should have any slightest doubt about that. There would be no Rome Statute and no ICC without the US. There would have been none of the developments in international law and international criminal justice from Nuremberg onwards without the US. There would have been no Genocide Convention without the US, but the US took 40 years to ratify the Genocide Convention. Don't be troubled, again, it's about having elements of patience and a perspective of the longue durée. Don't be troubled by incidental moments. The fact that the US signed the Rome Statute, but then didn't take it to ratification, and indeed sent this Bush letter saying, we disown this for purposes of customary international law, shouldn't take away from the fact that one day, I have absolutely every confidence, the US will ratify the Rome Statute of the ICC. I don't know when that will be, how long you have to wait, but there is no bigger driving force. They don't craft things as well as the British lawyers do, but they drive everything.
Okay, now that will start another war here, but let me turn to the last. Let me turn to the last 2 panelists for the final remarks.
Okay, well, I cannot leave that uncommented. I mean, the US voted against the Rome Statute in Rome as one of 7 states. So it's a bit hard to argue that the treaty would not exist without them, in my view. The US has played, I would say, a unique role in the area of international criminal justice, but I really would not say that the US is the biggest driver of international criminal justice. But it's a longer conversation. But I wanted to make that point. I also, I don't think the war in Ukraine is not unlawful. Of course, it's unlawful. What Ukrainians are doing is not unlawful because they're defending themselves. So that's Article 51. Everybody has the right to defend themselves. But the war itself is as unlawful as can be. And, we have in 1945, we created the UN. And essentially we said war is illegal pretty much always. But what we have done since is that we have created this, enormous set of laws that regulate what it is that you're allowed to do in an armed conflict. So, you're allowed to kill a soldier, you're not allowed to kill a civilian. You're allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. But it's all, all of this is governing the situation of war itself. So we have done very little to, in fact, say we are criminalizing the fact that you're conducting a war in the first place. And that's such a disbalance. And it's so defeats our point of departure, because our point of departure was war is illegal. And you know, the Geneva Conventions are fabulous, but everybody knows the moment you have a war, you have war crimes. And that is completely inevitable. And you typically have them of such a scale and number that we're sitting here and saying, well, it's completely impossible to prosecute all these people. So the only way to protect people is not to have the war. And that is, I think, something that we have to confront a bit differently than we have been doing in the past. Now on the questions, if I understood your question correctly, was cooperation between an international court and a national court, or?
I was wondering more like, were there precedents of basically prosecution of collaborationist crimes on the international rate?
Okay, so I mean, I think one principle that is extremely important to understand is the so-called principle of complementarity, and that means that every crime should be prosecuted in a national court. So the moment there is a war crime, the moment there is a genocide, the moment there is a crime against humanity, there is at least one jurisdiction that has competence. Typically, it's more than one. And there's universal jurisdiction over genocide, for example. So every time the International Criminal Court is asked to do something is because somebody else has failed to do their job, because national jurisdiction haven't done what they should have done. So the ICC is a court of last resort and should only become active when national courts do not do that. You asked a question about special tribunal aggression undermining the ICC. Very good question. And we did think about that actually for a pretty long time and came to the conclusion no, because the ICC has not had a single case of a crime of aggression. And there are a lot of states that are reluctant to see that crime prosecuted. This is the most brazen example of a crime of aggression. If this crime of aggression is not prosecuted now, I think it's far more unlikely that will be prosecuted also in the ICC in the future. And I completely agree with you. Ideally, the ICC should have jurisdiction, and in the future it should have jurisdiction, and we need to amend the Kampala amendments in this respect, and we're actually working on that in parallel. But I think there is another point here, namely, you know, in Rome, when we got together and we created the Rome Statute, the philosophy was that this is essentially consent-based. So states ratify and they subject themselves to the regime. It's 124 states who have done that, which is a lot of states, but it's also not 193, and that's the membership of the UN. So the philosophy then was, and in those cases where the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction, the Security Council of the United Nations will give jurisdiction to the ICC. And that is not going to happen. So that was in the 90s, something that we all like to think, and today we know it's not happening. It's not happening now, it's not happening tomorrow, it's not going to happen in the next 10 years, and if we're lucky, if we're very lucky if it happens thereafter. So we will have, in very exceptional cases, to look for alternatives to the ICC anyway, irrespective of what we do on Ukraine. And universal jurisdiction does a little in this respect, and I think it does something extremely important. But as far as what it can do in terms of scale, it will be extremely limited. I mean, Syria, I guess, is the example here. You know, atrocious crimes for well over a decade, systematic crimes against humanity, war crimes, everything. You can think of vetoed referral to the ICC in the Security Council, and a number of universal jurisdiction cases that are extremely important. Now an indictment against actually the president of Syria in France. So really, really, really important. But if you look at the number of crimes that have been committed, it's, yeah, if it's a drop in the bucket, that's a lot. On non-state actors, the answer is no. So there is no jurisdiction over acts committed by a non-state actor. The law applies only between states. It was not one of the, some people thought it should apply for the crime of aggression, yes, absolutely. That was the question only on crime of aggression. So the law governs the relationship between states only. Very few felt that non-state actors should be included, and they are not. There are a number of cases. There's an interesting case, of course, of a self-proclaimed state. That's the Islamic State. That, of course, is not a state, but that is a good example where states actually felt like by subjecting an entity like that to the law, it elevates them under international law to a point where we don't want to have them elevated. That's why the law doesn't apply. Character gravity or scale, it's as James has said. See, so this, sorry? Oh, sorry, yeah. So this was negotiated for a very, very long time, this clause. And the purpose of the clause is to make it clear that not every illegal use of force is aggression. And actually, it's only the most extreme forms of the illegal use of force. So not skirmishes on the border, not the example that James gave. So it's really the most extreme cases. You mentioned 2014. In my view, very clearly, also an act of aggression followed by an illegal annexation. No need to distinguish that legally from 2022.
Thank you. Okay,
I'll be very brief because with an eye on time, I just want to respond to two things. One is gravity as it relates to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and a genocide. Just to give a couple of examples how we prioritize cases in Bosnia and Herzegovina, gravity was interpreted as brutality of the crime, if it was particularly brutal, and now we discussed, what is brutal, but that's one criteria. Second is number of victims, for example. And thirdly, also the effect on the community. So if the crime itself had such a horrible effect on the community, it would be prioritized under this sort of idea of gravity. But it will depend on context, such as all of these discussions will. And just on trauma, of course, it can affect the testimony of potential witnesses. And there was, of course, word already on re-traumatizing potentially people that testify. It doesn't have to be necessarily the case. Not everyone is that sort of vulnerable, but some people are, and I think that's something that people have criticized in this effort to document in Ukraine. What I want to end with is just that I think even though international criminal justice for all of these 4 crimes is incredibly, incredibly important for many of the reasons that we have mentioned, at the end of the day, it cannot and should not be the only instrument that we reach for in situations like this. So, for example, supporting psychosocial support for traumatized, not only witnesses, but just people in general, to be able to pick up their lives from the ashes of everything that they've lost. So, for example, one of the things could be, I've seen in Bosnia and Herzegovina, one kind of effort, for example, identifying missing persons and returning remains for burial. That has incredible concrete impact on people's lives because they suffer greatly from missing a sort of family member. So I think it's really important to look at these complementary mechanisms and be like, these are the limitations of criminal justice. What else can we do to make this pain a little bit lighter for people? I guess that's what I would call for.
Please join me on behalf of the Liechtenstein Institute and the Program on Policy. Thank you. Wonderful discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.